Picture a medieval city at dawn. Streets narrow and winding, packed dirt beneath your feet. Buildings leaning so close together their upper floors nearly touch, blocking out the morning light. The smell hits you first. Human waste, animal manure, rotting garbage, all of it fermenting in the summer heat. Open sewers run down the middle of streets, carrying filth toward rivers that serve as both sewer and water supply. Dead animals decompose in alleys. Butchers throw offal into the streets. Tanners dump their toxic chemicals wherever convenient. The air is thick, cloying, filled with particles you can almost taste. People wake in houses where entire families sleep in single rooms, sometimes sharing beds, their bodies pressed together for warmth in winter, sweating against each other in summer. They've never heard of germs. They don't understand contagion. They have no concept of hygiene beyond basic cleanliness for comfort or religious ritual. They drink water drawn from wells, contaminated by their own waste. They eat food handled by unwashed hands, prepared in filthy kitchens, sold by vendors who wipe their noses and then touch the bread they're selling you. And somewhere in this city, perhaps in one of those crowded houses, perhaps in a merchant's shop near the docks, perhaps in a tavern where travelers gather and share drinks from communal cups, a person wakes feeling slightly off. A headache, a fever. Nothing serious yet. Nothing that would stop them from going about their day. They get up, they go to work, they interact with dozens, maybe hundreds of people. They cough, they sneeze, they touch surfaces, they share food. They have no idea they're about to kill everyone they know. This is how plagues spread before modern medicine. Not through dramatic, cinematic moments of people collapsing in the streets, though that happened too, eventually, but through ordinary days, ordinary interactions, ordinary ignorance about how disease moved through populations, like invisible fire, consuming everything in its path. This is the story of how humanity's greatest killer worked for thousands of years before anyone understood what was happening or how to stop it. This is the story of death moving through cities, kingdoms, continents, carried by rats and fleas and human contact and contaminated water and 1,000 other vectors that no one recognized until it was far, far too late. The ancient world had no shortage of diseases. Every civilization, every city, every village was constantly battling illness of one kind or another. Parasites infested intestines, making children sick and stunted. Respiratory infections killed the elderly and weak every winter. Dysentery swept through armies and communities, causing dehydration and death. Smallpox disfigured survivors and killed countless others. Malaria turned whole regions into death traps. Tuberculosis consumed its victims slowly, wasting them away over months or years. Disease was simply part of life. The question wasn't whether you would get sick, but when and whether you would survive. But plagues were different. Plagues weren't the steady background radiation of disease that every society learned to live with. Plagues were catastrophes. They arrived suddenly, killed enormous numbers of people in short periods, and then disappeared, sometimes for generations. They wiped out entire populations. They destabilized governments. They ended wars, not through victory, but through annihilation of the armies. They reshaped demographics, economics, and power structures in ways that lasted for centuries. Ancient writers described plagues with a mixture of horror and incomprehension. They wrote about cities where the living couldn't bury the dead fast enough, where corpses piled in the streets, where survivors fled in terror, abandoning homes and possessions. They wrote about symptoms that seemed designed by malicious gods. Buboes, swellings the size of eggs or apples, appearing in groins and armpits, turning black and bursting. Fevers so intense that people threw themselves into rivers seeking relief. Vomiting and diarrhea so severe that victims died of dehydration within days. Hemorrhaging that turned skin purple and black. Respiratory symptoms that drowned people in their own fluids. The plague of Athens, described in excruciating detail by Thucydides, struck during the Peloponnesian War in 430 BCE. It killed perhaps a third of Athens' population over the course of several years. Thucydides himself contracted the disease and survived, giving him the unique perspective of both observer and victim. He described how the plague began in Ethiopia, moved through Egypt, and finally reached Athens through the port of Piraeus. It struck hardest during the summer months. Victims developed sudden high fevers, inflammation of the eyes, bleeding from the throat and tongue, foul breath, coughing, vomiting, and violent spasms. Many developed ulcers on their skin. Some went mad. Some lost their fingers and toes to gangrene. The mortality rate was staggering. Most who contracted the disease died within 7 to 9 days. But here's what makes Thucydides' account so valuable and so haunting. He didn't just describe the symptoms. He described how the disease spread through human behavior. He noted that physicians died in large numbers because they had the most contact with the sick. He observed that people who nursed sick family members tended to contract the disease themselves. He recorded how the plague destroyed social bonds, how people abandoned dying relatives, how traditional funeral rites were ignored, how bodies were dumped in mass graves or left to rot because there was no one left to bury them properly. Thucydides was describing, without understanding it, the mechanisms of contagion. He was observing accurately that close contact with the sick increased risk of infection, that caring for plague victims was essentially a death sentence, that the disease moved through human networks, following lines of contact and interaction. He saw all of this clearly, but he had no framework to understand what he was seeing. No germ theory, no concept of microorganisms, no understanding of how infection actually worked. Like everyone in the ancient world, Thucydides attributed the plague to supernatural causes. Perhaps the gods were punishing Athens for some offense. Perhaps it was an Egyptian curse. Perhaps it was simply bad air, miasma rising from marshes or generated by the unburied corpses. The ancient understanding of disease was fundamentally wrong, but it was all they had. And based on that wrong understanding, they developed responses that ranged from useless to actively harmful. What was the plague of Athens actually? Modern scholars have debated this endlessly. Typhus, smallpox, measles, Ebola, some unknown disease that has since disappeared. The symptoms Thucydides described don't match perfectly with any single known disease, which has led to speculation that it might have been something that no longer circulates, or possibly a combination of diseases striking simultaneously, or perhaps Thucydides conflated symptoms from multiple outbreaks. We'll never know with certainty. Ancient plagues are medical mysteries that DNA analysis of skeletons sometimes helps solve, but often leaves frustratingly ambiguous. What we do know is that Athens never fully recovered. The plague killed Pericles, Athens' greatest leader. It killed thousands of soldiers and sailors, weakening Athens militarily at a critical moment in the war. It shattered morale and social cohesion. The psychological impact was as devastating as the mortality. People who survived watched their entire families die. They watched neighbors collapse in the streets. They watched the city's systems of order and care simply break down under the weight of so much death. And they had no explanation beyond divine anger or random cosmic cruelty. They couldn't fight what they couldn't understand. This pattern, plague arriving suddenly, killing indiscriminately, and then disappearing, leaving survivors traumatized and confused, repeated throughout ancient history. The Antonine Plague struck the Roman Empire during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, probably brought back by soldiers returning from campaigns in the Near East around 165 CE. It raged for over a decade, killing millions, possibly as much as a quarter of the empire's population in some regions. The symptoms, described by the physician Galen, suggest smallpox or measles, though again, we can't be entirely certain. Galen himself fled Rome when the plague was at its worst, which tells you something about ancient medical confidence in the face of epidemic disease. The most respected physician in the empire, personal doctor to emperors, took one look at the plague and got out of the city. He understood, at least implicitly, that he could do nothing to stop it. His medical knowledge, sophisticated by ancient standards, was useless against a disease that spread faster than he could treat it and killed most who contracted it. The Antonine Plague had enormous consequences for the Roman Empire. Military recruitment became difficult as the pool of healthy young men shrank. Agricultural production declined as farmers died and fields went untilled. Trade disrupted, tax revenues collapsed. The empire struggled to maintain its borders and internal stability while hemorrhaging population. Some historians argue that the Antonine Plague marked the beginning of Rome's long decline, that the empire never fully recovered its demographic and economic strength. that this unseen killer weakened Rome more effectively than any barbarian army could. And then, even more devastating, came the plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century CE, named after the bishop who described it. This plague struck an already weakened empire, killing thousands daily at its peak in major cities like Rome and Alexandria. The symptoms were horrific. Continuous vomiting and diarrhea, burning fever, gangrenous feet and hands, eyes and ears filled with pus. Many victims went blind. The mortality rate was catastrophic. Cyprian himself estimated that the plague was killing 5,000 people per day in Rome at its height, though that number might be exaggerated. Even accounting for ancient tendency toward dramatic overstatement, the death toll was clearly enormous. Cyprian, as a Christian bishop, interpreted the plague through a theological lens. He saw it as evidence that the world was ending, that Christ's return was imminent. For Cyprian, the plague was divine judgment, a sign that the apocalypse was approaching. This interpretation wasn't unique to Christianity. Across cultures and religions, people tried to make sense of plagues by fitting them into existing belief systems. The gods were angry, demons were attacking, the stars had aligned unfavorably, evil spirits needed appeasement. These explanations were wrong, but they served psychological functions. They provided meaning, they suggested possible responses, rituals, sacrifices, prayers that might restore order. The problem was that these responses didn't work. You could sacrifice 100 bulls to Apollo, and the plague continued. You could pray and fast and flagellate yourself, and the disease kept spreading. You could wear amulets and burn incense and avoid unlucky numbers, and the deaths accumulated. Ancient people weren't stupid. They could observe that their remedies failed, but they interpreted failure as insufficient piety or wrong technique, not as evidence that their fundamental understanding of disease was flawed. If the sacrifice didn't stop the plague, perhaps a bigger sacrifice was needed. If prayer didn't work, perhaps the gods wanted a different kind of prayer. The possibility that gods had nothing to do with it, that invisible organisms were responsible, was literally unthinkable in their framework. The mechanisms by which ancient plagues spread were varied, complex, and completely invisible to people experiencing them. Modern epidemiology has identified multiple routes of disease transmission: direct person-to-person contact, respiratory droplets from coughing and sneezing, contaminated food and water, vectors like mosquitoes, fleas, and lice, fomites, objects that carry infectious material, sexual transmission. Each disease has its preferred routes, though many can spread through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. But ancient people saw none of this. They saw people getting sick, suffering, dying. They saw patterns sometimes, recognized that diseases seemed to cluster, that they spread from person to person, that certain behaviors increased risk. But they couldn't see the actual mechanisms. They couldn't see bacteria multiplying in contaminated water. They couldn't see viruses hijacking cells and replicating. They couldn't see fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, jumping from rats to humans. All the actual causes of disease transmission were invisible to them. Water was perhaps the most important and least understood vector of disease in the ancient world. Clean water is essential for human survival, but clean water was remarkably rare in ancient cities. Wells could become contaminated by seepage from latrines, graves, or waste disposal sites. Rivers that served as water sources also served as sewers, receiving human and animal waste, industrial runoff, dead animals, and every other form of pollution. The same river that provided drinking water downstream was being used as a toilet upstream. Some ancient civilizations understood, at least partially, that water quality mattered. Roman aqueducts brought fresh water from distant sources into cities, a massive engineering achievement that improved public health enormously. But even Romans didn't understand why fresh water was better. They thought it tasted better. They thought it was pure, in some aesthetic or spiritual sense. They didn't know that fresh flowing water was less likely to harbor cholera, bacteria, or dysentery-causing organisms or parasites. They built aqueducts because the water was nicer, not because they understood disease transmission. The beneficial effects on health were accidental, and even with aqueducts, Roman water systems had problems. Lead pipes could leach toxic metals into drinking water. Distribution systems could become contaminated. Public baths, while luxurious and socially important, were breeding grounds for disease. Hundreds of people bathing in the same unfiltered, unchlorinated water, sharing that water with their sweat, their skin cells, their urine, because yes, people urinated in the baths, and you can't convince me otherwise. The water was changed periodically, but between changes, it was essentially a disease soup. Cholera, one of history's great killers, spreads primarily through contaminated water. The disease is caused by Vibrio cholerae, a bacterium that lives in water and causes severe diarrhea. Victims can lose liters of fluid in hours, dying of dehydration within a day if untreated. In the ancient world, cholera outbreaks were devastatingly lethal, and they spread exactly how you'd expect. One person with cholera defecates, contaminates a water source. Dozens or hundreds of people drink from that source. They all get cholera, they all defecate, contaminating more water sources, and the cycle accelerates. Entire cities could be infected within days. But ancient people didn't understand this mechanism. They saw people drinking from wells and getting sick, but they attributed it to bad air around the wells, or divine punishment, or planetary alignments. They rarely made the connection between human waste and drinking water, even when the two were obviously related. The concept that something invisible in the water could make you sick was beyond their conceptual framework. Typhoid fever caused by Salmonella typhi spread the same way. Contaminated water or food, usually food prepared by someone who carried the disease. The symptoms were different from cholera, high fever, headache, weakness, rose-colored spots on the chest, but the result was often the same: death, especially for children, the elderly, the already weakened by malnutrition or other diseases. Dysentery, which is actually multiple diseases with similar symptoms, devastated armies throughout ancient history. Soldiers encamped in one place for extended periods, drinking from the same water sources, defecating in the same areas, living in close quarters, were sitting ducks for waterborne diseases. Military history is filled with campaigns that failed, not because of battlefield defeats, but because dysentery killed or incapacitated so many soldiers that offensive operations became impossible. The Roman historian Livy describes armies losing more men to disease than to combat. He records, sometimes with evident frustration, how carefully planned campaigns collapsed because half the army was too sick to fight, cramping and shitting themselves in their tents while the enemy waited across the field. Commanders had no solution. They couldn't see the bacteria in the water. They couldn't make the connection between camp hygiene and disease rates. They suffered and died in ignorance. Some ancient military leaders learned through trial and error that certain practices reduce disease. Changing camp locations frequently helped, probably because it prevented the buildup of contamination around water sources. Boiling water, practiced in some cultures for ritual or culinary reasons, accidentally killed bacteria and reduced disease transmission. But these practices were maintained through tradition and superstition, not understanding. If someone asked why boiling water was important, the answer wouldn't be, it kills harmful microorganisms. It would be, it's what we've always done. Or, it pleases the gods. Or, my grandfather said to do it. Food was another major vector for disease that ancient people understood poorly. Contaminated food causes everything from mild stomach upset to fatal food poisoning. Bacteria like Salmonella, E. coli, and Staphylococcus thrive in improperly stored or prepared food. Parasites like tapeworms, roundworms, and flukes enter human bodies through undercooked meat or fish. Mold produces toxins that cause serious illness. All of this was completely invisible to ancient cooks and eaters. Food preservation techniques developed through trial and error. Salting preserved meat and fish by creating an environment where bacteria couldn't thrive. Though ancient people didn't know this, they knew that salted meat didn't rot as quickly as fresh meat, so they salted it. Smoking worked similarly, the combination of drying and chemical compounds in smoke, preventing bacterial growth. Fermentation, used to make cheese, yogurt, pickles, and alcoholic beverages, worked by encouraging beneficial bacteria that outcompeted harmful ones. These techniques saved countless lives, but the people using them had no idea why they worked. Food markets in ancient cities were nightmares from a food safety perspective. Meat sold in open-air stalls, unrefrigerated, covered in flies, handled by vendors whose hands were never truly clean. Fish that had been dead for days, beginning to decompose in the heat. Milk sold from containers that were never properly sterilized. Bread baked in ovens that rodents had access to overnight. Every meal was a gamble, though ancient people didn't think of it that way. They ate what was available and hoped they wouldn't get sick. Sometimes they did get sick, violently and obviously. Sometimes they carried low-level infections that made them chronically ill without ever knowing why. Parasites deserved their own special mention because they were absolutely endemic in the ancient world. Intestinal worms infected probably the majority of the population in many ancient societies. Tapeworms, roundworms, hookworms, whipworms, the list goes on. These parasites entered through contaminated food and water, or in the case of hookworms, through bare feet walking in soil contaminated with infected feces. Once inside, they stole nutrients, caused pain and inflammation, and in severe cases could cause intestinal blockages or migrate to other organs. Ancient people were aware that worms existed in human intestines. They saw them in feces. Some ancient medical texts describe treatments for worm infections, usually herbal concoctions that may or may not have been effective. But they didn't understand the life cycles of these parasites, didn't know how they got into human bodies, didn't connect them to contaminated food and water. The worms were just another misery to endure, another affliction that you accepted as part of life. The sheer variety of parasites that plagued ancient populations is staggering. Ascaris lumbricoids, giant roundworms that could grow over a foot long, lived in the intestines and occasionally migrated into other organs or even emerged from the mouth or nose, a horrifying experience for victims. Trichuris trichiura. Whipworms caused dysentery-like symptoms and could persist for years. Enterobius vermicularis, pinworms, caused intense anal itching and spread easily through contaminated hands and surfaces, especially in crowded households where children shared beds. Outside the intestines, other parasites cause different horrors. Schistosomiasis, caused by flatworms that penetrate the skin when people wade in contaminated water, plagued agricultural societies throughout Africa and Asia. The worms migrated through the bloodstream to various organs, causing inflammation, organ damage, and chronic illness. Ancient Egyptian mummies show evidence of schistosomiasis, proof that this parasite tormented populations for thousands of years. Guinea worm, Dracunculus medinensis, caused one of the most painful and distinctive parasitic infections. People contracted it by drinking water containing infected copepods, tiny crustaceans. The larvae matured in the body over the course of a year, growing into worms that could reach 3 feet in length. When ready to reproduce, the adult worm migrated to the skin, usually on the lower leg or foot, and created a painful blister. When the victim sought relief by immersing the affected limb in water, the worm emerged and released its larvae, continuing the cycle. The only treatment was slowly wrapping the emerging worm around a stick and pulling it out over days or weeks, being careful not to break it because a broken worm left in the body caused severe infections. Ancient texts mention guinea worm, and the traditional treatment method, winding the worm around a stick, may be the origin of the rod of Asclepius, the symbol of medicine showing a snake wrapped around a staff. If true, it's a perfect example of how ancient medicine developed from practical experience with visible parasites while remaining ignorant of invisible bacteria and viruses. Respiratory diseases spread through a different mechanism. Coughing, sneezing, even just breathing released droplets containing viruses or bacteria. These droplets could be inhaled by anyone nearby. In crowded ancient cities, where people lived in close quarters, where ventilation was poor, where people gathered in enclosed spaces, respiratory diseases spread like wildfire. Tuberculosis, one of history's most persistent killers, spread primarily through respiratory droplets. Someone with active TB coughed, expelled bacteria-laden droplets, and anyone who inhaled those droplets could become infected. The disease then developed slowly, sometimes taking years to manifest symptoms. By the time someone was obviously sick with TB, they'd probably already infected multiple other people. Ancient physicians recognized TB, called it consumption because of how it seemed to consume victims from within, wasting them away. But they had no effective treatments and no understanding of how it spread. The symptoms of tuberculosis were distinctive and terrifying. a persistent cough that produced bloody sputum. Progressive weight loss despite adequate food, night sweats that soaked through bedding, extreme fatigue, fever. The disease targeted the lungs primarily, but could affect other organs as well, causing spinal deformities, joint infections, and kidney damage. The progression was usually slow, taking months or years during which the victim remained infectious, spreading bacteria to family members, friends, anyone who spent time in close proximity. Skeletal evidence shows that tuberculosis afflicted ancient populations worldwide. Egyptian mummies display characteristic spinal deformities caused by TB. Skeletal remains from ancient Greece, Rome, China, and the Americas all show evidence of tuberculous infection. The disease was ubiquitous, persistent, and until the development of antibiotics in the 20th century, largely untreatable. Influenza, while probably not as devastating in the ancient world as in later periods, still circulated and killed. The flu virus mutates rapidly, creating new strains that populations have no immunity to. Major flu pandemics occur when particularly virulent strains emerge. The ancient world probably experienced these pandemics, though the historical record is murky. What we know is that respiratory diseases that came on suddenly, spread rapidly, and killed primarily through overwhelming the lungs' ability to function, afflicted ancient populations regularly. The symptoms of severe influenza can progress from mild to fatal within days. High fever, body aches, cough, and exhaustion develop suddenly. In severe cases, the infection causes pneumonia, filling the lungs with fluid and making breathing increasingly difficult. The victim essentially drowns in their own fluids. Secondary bacterial infections often finish what the virus started, killing patients whose immune systems were already weakened by fighting the viral infection. Measles and smallpox, both highly contagious viral diseases, spread through respiratory droplets and also through contact with the fluid from infected sores. These diseases were absolutely devastating when they reached populations with no prior exposure. The mortality rates in immunologically naive populations could exceed 50%. Children were especially vulnerable. Ancient civilizations that had been exposed to these diseases for generations developed some population-level immunity. Children still got sick, but many survived, gaining lifelong immunity. But when these diseases reached new populations, they acted like plagues, killing enormous numbers. Smallpox deserves particular attention because of its historical impact and its distinctive presentation. The disease caused by the variola virus began with fever, headache, and back pain. A rash appeared after a few days, starting in the mouth and throat before spreading across the face and body. The rash progressed through stages, from flat red spots to raised bumps, to fluid-filled pustules to scabs. In severe cases, the pustules merged into sheets, a form called confluent smallpox that was almost always fatal. Survivors were often left with deep pitted scars, particularly on the face, and sometimes blindness from corneal damage. The mortality rate varied depending on the strain and the population's immune status. In populations with some prior exposure, mortality might be 20 to 30%. In virgin soil epidemics, when the disease struck populations with no previous contact, mortality could reach 70 to 90%. The disease was especially deadly to infants, pregnant women, and anyone with compromised immune systems. Ancient texts describe diseases that were almost certainly smallpox. Chinese medical texts from over 3,000 years ago describe a disease with characteristic pustular rash. Sanskrit texts from ancient India describe similar symptoms. Egyptian mummies show pockmark scarring consistent with smallpox infection. The disease was widespread, endemic in many regions, a constant threat that killed millions over the course of human history. The arrival of smallpox in the Americas after European contact is the most famous example of virgin soil epidemic, but the pattern occurred throughout history. When the Roman Empire expanded into new territories, legions brought diseases that local populations had never encountered. When trade routes opened between previously isolated regions, diseases traveled along those routes, devastating communities that had no biological defenses. The Silk Road wasn't just a conduit for goods and ideas, It was a highway for pathogens. Merchants traveling from China to Central Asia to Persia to Rome carried diseases along with silk and spices. Each trading post, each caravanserai, each market became a potential mixing point where diseases from different regions could exchange. A merchant from China might carry a respiratory infection to Samarkand, where it infected a Persian trader who carried it to Constantinople, where it infected a Roman merchant who brought it back to Italy. The global disease exchange accelerated with increasing trade connectivity, and then there were the vector-borne diseases, transmitted by insects and other organisms. Malaria, spread by mosquitoes, turned entire regions into death traps. The plasmodium parasites that cause malaria have a complex life cycle involving both mosquitoes and humans. Mosquitoes bite infected humans, pick up the parasites, and then transmit them to new victims. The disease causes recurring fevers, chills, and anemia. It can be fatal, especially in children and pregnant women, but many survive to suffer repeated infections throughout their lives. Ancient people knew that swampy areas were unhealthy. They observed that people living near marshes got sick more often. They connected the bad air, the miasma, from swamps with disease. But they didn't understand that mosquitoes were the actual transmission vector. The name malaria literally means bad air. They were close. They recognized the environmental association, but they missed the actual mechanism. It wouldn't be until the late 19th century that Ronald Ross proved mosquitoes transmitted malaria, work that earned him a Nobel Prize. Malaria shaped ancient civilizations in profound ways. Regions where malaria was endemic developed population-level adaptations. The sickle cell trait, which causes sickle cell disease when inherited from both parents, but provides malaria resistance when inherited from only one parent, became common in malarial regions of Africa and the Mediterranean. Thalassemia, another genetic blood disorder, similarly provided malaria resistance and became prevalent in Mediterranean populations. These genetic adaptations demonstrate how powerfully malaria influenced human evolution. The impact on daily life in malarial regions was enormous. During malaria season, typically the wet months when mosquito populations exploded, entire communities might be incapacitated by recurring fevers. Agricultural work became impossible, trade slowed, government functions disrupted. The disease didn't usually kill quickly in endemic populations where people had some acquired immunity, but it sapped energy, reduced productivity, and created chronic illness that made every other hardship worse. Military campaigns in malarial regions faced devastating losses. Alexander the Great's army suffered terribly from what was probably malaria during campaigns in southern Asia. Roman legions struggled to operate in malarial regions of Italy, particularly the marshlands around Rome itself. Commanders learned to avoid certain regions during certain seasons, but they understood it as avoiding bad air, not avoiding mosquitoes. The draining of swamps was practiced by some ancient civilizations as a way to improve agriculture and reduce disease. Romans drained the Pontine marshes near Rome multiple times, though the marshes repeatedly reflooded. The health benefits of swamp drainage were observed, but misunderstood. Fewer mosquitoes meant less malaria, but ancient engineers thought they were eliminating miasma, not breeding grounds for disease vectors. Bubonic plague, history's most infamous killer, spread primarily through fleas living on rats. Yersinia pestis bacteria lived in rodent populations transmitted between rats by fleas. When rat populations crashed, either from the plague itself or from other causes, infected fleas sought new hosts. Humans, living in close proximity to rats, were convenient targets. The fleas bit humans, transmitted the bacteria, and boom, bubonic plague. The disease caused the famous buboes, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpit, and neck. These buboes could grow to the size of eggs or apples and were excruciatingly painful. Many turned black and burst, oozing pus. The mortality rate was somewhere between 60 and 90% if untreated. Death usually came within a week. The plague could also manifest in pneumonic form, spreading through respiratory droplets and killing even faster, or septicemic form, infecting the bloodstream directly and killing within hours. The Justinianic plague, which struck the Byzantine Empire beginning in 541 CE, was probably bubonic plague, though again, absolute certainty is impossible without DNA evidence, which has been found in some cases from later plague outbreaks. the plague ravaged Constantinople and spread throughout the Mediterranean world. The historian Procopius described corpses piling up because the living couldn't bury the dead fast enough. He described the city's commerce collapsing, fields going untilled, starvation following plague as the food supply disrupted. Procopius provided gruesome details about the plague's progression. Victims developed sudden fevers and the characteristic buboes. Some fell into comas, some became delirious, experiencing hallucinations and paranoid delusions that made them violent. Some developed black blisters across their bodies. The pneumonic form was especially feared because victims coughed up blood and died within hours of symptom onset, often infecting everyone around them in their final moments. The social breakdown during the plague was as horrifying as the disease itself. Procopius described how normal human decency disappeared. Families abandoned dying relatives. The rich fled to country estates, leaving cities to the poor and sick. Looters ransacked homes of the dead and dying. Traditional funeral rites were abandoned as the sheer number of corpses overwhelmed every burial ground. Bodies were thrown into the sea, dumped in ditches, or simply left in homes to decompose. Emperor Justinian himself contracted the plague and survived, which was remarkable given the mortality rates. But the empire never recovered. Justinian's ambitious plans to reconquer the Western Roman Empire faltered. Military campaigns stalled as armies were decimated by disease. Tax revenues collapsed as the population shrank. The economic disruption lasted for decades. Trade networks fragmented. Cities shrank as survivors fled to the countryside. The plague killed millions, destroyed the Byzantine economy, and changed Mediterranean history. And the people experiencing it had no idea what was happening. They didn't know about rats or fleas or bacteria. They saw people dying horribly and attributed it to God's wrath or demonic attack or cosmic misalignment. Some blamed earthquakes that had occurred before the plague, believing they'd released poisonous vapors from the earth. Some blamed comets, seeing them as omens of divine anger. Some blamed Jews, foreigners, or other convenient scapegoats, leading to pogroms and massacres that added human violence to natural catastrophe. The plague recurred in waves for the next 2 centuries, each wave killing thousands more. The pattern became grimly familiar. The disease would appear in one region, spread along trade routes to other areas, kill enormous numbers, and then disappear, only to return years or decades later. Each recurrence traumatized populations that had just begun to recover from the previous outbreak. The most tragic aspect of ancient disease transmission was that many of the behaviors that seemed like reasonable responses actually made things worse. When plague struck, people fled cities, trying to escape the contagion, but they often carried the disease with them, spreading it to new areas. Fleeing made sense. If everyone around you is dying, leaving seems rational, but it transformed local outbreaks into widespread epidemics. The wealthy had the resources to flee. They owned country estates where they could retreat with their families and servants, isolating themselves from urban crowding and disease. But their flight often carried the plague to previously unaffected rural areas. A rich merchant fleeing Rome might arrive at his villa, already incubating plague, infecting his household staff and local villagers before developing symptoms himself. The poor couldn't flee. They lacked resources for travel and had nowhere to go. They remained in cities, crowded into tenements and slums, watching the rich abandon them, dying in far greater numbers because of their inability to escape. Plague was never just a medical crisis. It was a social and economic crisis that hit the poor, the enslaved, the marginalized far harder than the wealthy and powerful. Gathering for religious ceremonies to pray for divine intervention packed people together in enclosed spaces, perfect conditions for respiratory disease transmission. Temples, churches, synagogues, mosques, all became hotspots for disease spread during epidemics. Hundreds or thousands of people crowding into enclosed spaces, praying, singing, breathing each other's air, touching the same holy objects, sharing communion cups or ritual meals, created ideal conditions for respiratory pathogens to jump from host to host. Religious leaders sometimes recognized the danger and suspended services during severe outbreaks. But often, the opposite occurred. Religious fervor intensified during plagues. People desperate for divine help attended services even when sick, believing that prayer and divine intervention were their only hope. The more terrified people became, the more they sought religious comfort, and the faster the disease spread through congregations. Processions and pilgrimages during plagues were especially effective at spreading disease. Thousands of people marching through streets, touching sacred relics, crowding into holy sites, and then dispersing to their home communities acted as super spreader events before that term existed. The 1348 Black Death in Europe spread partly through Jubilee pilgrims traveling to Rome, mixing with pilgrims from across Europe, and then returning home carrying the plague to previously unaffected regions. Caring for sick family members, a basic human duty, an expression of love, exposed caregivers to infection. In most ancient societies, family members cared for the sick at home. Professional medical care was expensive and often ineffective, so families handled illness themselves. A wife nursed her sick husband, a mother cared for sick children, siblings looked after each other. These acts of love and duty became death sentences during plague outbreaks. Ancient observers noticed this pattern. Thucydides explicitly noted that those who cared for the sick in Athens got sick themselves. Procopius made similar observations during the Justinianic plague, but knowing that caring for plague victims was dangerous didn't stop people from doing it. Abandoning sick family members violated fundamental social norms. Some people did it, especially as terror mounted and social bonds broke down, but many, perhaps most, stayed and cared for their loved ones, knowing they would probably die as a result. Physicians who treated the sick, the bravest and most dedicated members of society, died in disproportionate numbers because of their constant exposure to contagious patients. Galen fled Rome during the Antonine Plague, but many physicians stayed, treating patients until they themselves fell ill. The mortality rate among physicians during plague outbreaks was enormous. Some cities lost most or all of their physicians early in epidemics, leaving survivors with no medical care at all. The loss of physicians had cascading effects. Without medical professionals, even minor injuries or illnesses became life-threatening. Women died in childbirth that skilled midwives could have handled. Broken bones set improperly, causing permanent disability. Simple infections became fatal. The plague killed directly, but it also killed indirectly by destroying medical infrastructure. Burial practices sometimes spread disease. Handling corpses, washing bodies for burial, gathering for funerals, all created opportunities for transmission. The dead couldn't infect the living directly in most cases, but the rituals surrounding death brought people together and exposed them to whatever had killed the deceased. Some cultures burned their dead, which actually prevented disease transmission more effectively than burial, but for cultural reasons, not epidemiological ones. Hindu cremation practices, which developed partly for religious reasons related to purification and release of the soul, accidentally provided protection against disease spread from corpses. Burning bodies destroys pathogens, preventing corpses from becoming sources of contamination. But ancient Hindus didn't cremate the dead to prevent disease spread. They did it because their religion required it. The health benefit was entirely accidental. Islamic burial practices, which require washing the deceased's body and burying it as quickly as possible, ideally within 24 hours, similarly reduced disease transmission risk, though again for religious rather than epidemiological reasons. Fast burial prevented corpses from decomposing and potentially contaminating water or soil. Ritual washing, while it exposed washers to the deceased's body, was done carefully and followed by ritual ablutions that provided some hygienic benefit. Jewish burial practices involved washing and preparing the body, often by specialized burial society members who understood they were taking on risk. The requirement for fast burial, usually within 24 hours, limited decomposition. These practices evolved for religious reasons, but had secondary health benefits that probably reduced disease transmission during plague outbreaks. Ancient medicine was almost entirely useless against epidemic disease. Physicians had sophisticated theories about health and illness, theories that made logical sense within their framework, but were fundamentally wrong. The humoral theory, a dominant in Greco-Roman medicine, held that the body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant these humors were in balance. Illness meant imbalance. Treatment involved restoring balance through various means. Bloodletting, removing blood to reduce an excess of that humor, was a standard treatment for many conditions. It was based on logical reasoning within the humoral framework. Patient has a fever which is associated with heat and blood, therefore removing blood should cool the patient and restore balance. The problem was that bloodletting weakened already sick patients, making them more likely to die, not less. But physicians persisted with the practice because their theory said it should work. The techniques for bloodletting varied. Phlebotomy involved cutting a vein and allowing blood to flow into a basin. Physicians believed different veins connected to different organs, so they selected bleeding sites based on the illness being treated. Scarification involved making multiple shallow cuts to draw blood from a broader area. Cupping used heated cups applied to the skin, creating suction that drew blood to the surface and sometimes broke the skin to release it. Leeches were also used for bloodletting, particularly in regions where they were readily available. The leeches attached to the skin and sucked blood, releasing anticoagulants that kept blood flowing even after the leech detached. Physicians thought they were removing corrupted blood. In reality, they were removing blood the patient needed and potentially introducing infections from non-sterile leeches. The amount of blood removed could be substantial. In severe cases, physicians might drain a pint or more, believing that dramatic intervention was needed for dramatic illness. For a patient already weakened by fever, dehydration, or infection, losing that much blood could be fatal. Modern analysis suggests that bloodletting probably killed far more patients than it helped, but ancient physicians had no way to conduct controlled studies comparing outcomes between bled and non-bled patients. Purging, inducing vomiting, or diarrhea to remove bad humors similarly weakened patients. Patients already dehydrated from disease-induced vomiting and diarrhea would be given emetics or purgatives to make them vomit and defecate more. The logic was that this expelled the disease. The reality was that it hastened death through dehydration. Emetics were substances that induced vomiting. Ipecac syrup, derived from a South American plant, was commonly used. Hellebore, a toxic plant, induced violent vomiting but could also cause fatal poisoning if the dose was too high. Salt water, mustard water, and various herbal concoctions were used to make patients vomit repeatedly. Purgatives induced diarrhea through various mechanisms. Senna, aloe, and other plants containing compounds that irritated the intestines caused powerful, sometimes uncontrollable bowel movements. Mercury compounds, though poisonous, were used as purgatives. Castor oil, while less dangerous, caused severe diarrhea and cramping. Physicians administered these substances in increasing doses if the patient didn't respond, sometimes continuing until the patient was too weak to survive the treatment. Some ancient treatments accidentally helped. Herbal remedies that reduced fever or eased pain provided comfort. Willow bark, containing salicylic acid precursor to aspirin, reduced fever and inflammation. Opium poppy derivatives provided pain relief and allowed patients to sleep, giving their immune systems time to fight infections. But these beneficial effects were accidental. Physicians prescribed these remedies based on humoral theory, not understanding of their actual mechanisms. Rest and hydration, basic supportive care, allowed patients' own immune systems to fight disease. A patient kept comfortable, encouraged to drink fluids, protected from secondary infections, had better chances of survival than one subjected to aggressive, harmful treatments. But ancient physicians often couldn't bring themselves to simply rest and observe. They felt compelled to do something, to intervene dramatically, to justify their expertise and fees. Some remedies had genuine medicinal properties that weren't understood. Honey, used as a wound dressing in many cultures, has antibacterial properties that prevented infections. Garlic, prescribed for various conditions, has some antimicrobial activity. Molds and fermented substances, occasionally used in wound care, sometimes delivered proto-antibiotics. But these successes were rare and their mechanisms unknown. The placebo effect probably accounted for some treatment successes. Patients who believed they were receiving effective medicine sometimes improved because of psychological factors affecting immune function. but placebo effects are unreliable and insufficient against serious infectious diseases. A patient with bubonic plague wasn't going to recover because they believed in their physician's herbal remedy. Ancient physicians were trapped by their wrong theories. They were intelligent, observant, dedicated to helping patients. Many were genuinely compassionate and spent their lives trying to understand disease and develop better treatments. But their fundamental understanding of disease was flawed, and so their treatments ranged from useless to actively harmful. The tragedy was that they couldn't see this. They had no way to conduct controlled experiments. They had no statistical methods to analyze outcomes. They relied on anecdotal evidence and theoretical reasoning, both of which can lead to completely wrong conclusions. A few physicians, based on clinical observation, began questioning established theories. They noticed that some treatments didn't work. They observed that patients who received no treatment sometimes fared better than those who received aggressive intervention. But challenging medical orthodoxy was difficult and dangerous. Physicians who contradicted Galen or Hippocrates risked professional ostracism, loss of patience, and accusations of incompetence or heresy. The medical profession had strong incentives to maintain existing theories. Physicians spent years studying classical texts. Their prestige and authority derived from mastery of established knowledge. Admitting that Galen was wrong, that the humoral theory was false, would undermine their entire professional identity. So most physicians defended orthodoxy, even when clinical experience suggested it wasn't working. Quarantine was one of the few effective public health measures ancient societies developed, though they didn't understand why it worked. The concept was simple: separate the sick from the healthy to prevent disease spread. Some ancient societies practiced forms of quarantine during epidemics. Individuals or families showing symptoms might be isolated in their homes or removed to facilities outside the city. Ships arriving from plague-affected areas might be required to wait offshore for periods before passengers and cargo could land. Biblical texts describe quarantine-like practices for leprosy and other skin diseases. Affected individuals were isolated from the community until examined by priests who determined whether they could return. The isolation period wasn't based on understanding of disease transmission, but on concepts of ritual purity and divine pollution. Still, the practice probably reduced spread of contagious skin diseases, even if the reasoning was wrong. Medieval Venice developed more systematic quarantine procedures during the Black Death, requiring ships from plague regions to anchor offshore for 40 days, 40 giorni, hence the term quarantine, before passengers and cargo could land. The 40-day period was chosen for symbolic religious reasons, but it was long enough to identify most plague cases, as the disease's incubation period is usually less than a week. Crew members who developed symptoms during the waiting period could be identified and prevented from bringing plague ashore. These measures worked when they were actually enforced because they reduced contact between infected and uninfected individuals. But enforcement was difficult. How do you identify who's sick in a disease's incubation period before symptoms appear? How do you stop desperate people from fleeing quarantine? How do you maintain quarantine when the people supposed to enforce it are dying too? Quarantine theory was sound. Quarantine practice was messy and often unsuccessful. Ships under quarantine sometimes saw their entire crews die while anchored offshore. Ghost ships floating in harbors with no one left alive to sail them. Quarantine facilities on land became death traps where sick and healthy people mixed together, often infecting those who arrived healthy. Guards assigned to enforce quarantine fled when plague broke out. Quarantine stations were burned by angry mobs who feared they were sources of contamination. The social resistance to quarantine was intense. Being quarantined meant likely death, as you were confined with infected individuals in places with minimal care or supplies. Families separated by quarantine measures sometimes never reunited. Merchants whose goods were quarantined suffered financial ruin. Ship captains whose vessels were held offshore lost cargoes and faced bankruptcy. These economic and social costs created powerful incentives to evade quarantine, even when people understood it might be necessary. The other, partially effective measure was basic sanitation, though again, understanding was limited. Some societies developed relatively sophisticated sanitation systems. Roman sewers and aqueducts removed waste and provided cleaner water. Chinese systems for managing human waste and using it as fertilizer after composting turned a disease hazard into agricultural benefit. Islamic emphasis on cleanliness and ritual washing reduced person-to-person transmission of some diseases. Roman public latrines, while not private or particularly hygienic by modern standards, at least concentrated waste in specific locations where it could be managed. The latrines were usually built over flowing water channels that carried waste to sewers and eventually to rivers or the sea. This system removed human waste from living areas, reducing contamination of food and water supplies. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, was an engineering marvel that drained the Forum and carried away waste from public latrines. Built in the 6th century BCE and continuously expanded, it allowed Rome to maintain a population of over 1 million people in relatively sanitary conditions. The sewer wasn't perfect. It sometimes backed up during floods. It created foul smells, but it prevented the accumulation of waste in streets that characterized less sophisticated cities. Chinese agriculture developed sophisticated composting systems that converted human and animal waste into fertilizer after allowing it to decompose in controlled conditions. The composting process generated heat that killed many pathogens, making the fertilizer safer than raw waste. This system solved two problems simultaneously: disposing of waste and improving soil fertility. But the Chinese developed it to improve agriculture, not to prevent disease. Islamic cultures, influenced by religious requirements for ritual purity, emphasized personal cleanliness and hand washing. Mosques had facilities for ablutions before prayer. Public bathhouses provided bathing opportunities for people who lacked facilities at home. These practices reduced transmission of diseases spread by skin contact and contaminated hands, but they were maintained for religious reasons, not medical ones. Cities that failed to maintain sanitation systems suffered predictable consequences. Waste accumulated in streets, creating breeding grounds for flies, rats, and disease. Water sources became contaminated as waste seeped into wells or flowed into rivers used for drinking water. Disease rates soared during hot weather, when decomposing waste bred insects and bacterial contamination spread more easily. Medieval European cities, many of which abandoned Roman sanitation infrastructure after the empire's collapse, became disease incubators. Streets were open sewers, chamber pots were emptied from upper-story windows, dead animals rotted where they fell, the stench was overwhelming, and disease was constant, with periodic plague outbreaks devastating populations that were already weakened by chronic illness. Personal hygiene varied enormously across cultures and social classes. Elites in many societies bathed regularly, wore clean clothes, and lived in relatively clean environments. Roman elites bathed daily in public or private baths. They wore fresh togas, laundered by servants or slaves. They lived in homes with hippocaust heating and private latrines. But peasants and urban poor often had no access to bathing facilities, wore the same clothes until they literally fell apart, and lived in hovels that were breeding grounds for parasites and disease. Bathing required fuel to heat water, soap or cleaning agents, and facilities for washing and drying, luxuries beyond reach for most of the population. The correlation between hygiene and health was observable but poorly understood. Wealthy people who bathed regularly and lived in clean environments tended to be healthier and live longer than poor people in filthy conditions. But the wealthy also had better nutrition, less physically demanding work, access to medical care, and numerous other advantages. Separating the effects of hygiene from other factors was impossible without controlled studies. Some ancient cultures developed taboos around contact with corpses, bodily fluids, and sick people that accidentally provided protection against disease transmission. Jewish dietary and purity laws prohibited contact with dead bodies and required ritual washing afterward. These rules probably reduced disease transmission from corpses, though they were maintained as religious obligations, not health measures. Hindu notions of pollution and purity created social practices that sometimes reduced disease spread. Caste restrictions that limited contact between groups, while unjust and oppressive, may have accidentally acted as a form of social distancing during outbreaks. Practices around deaths and mourning that required isolation. Periods may have provided quarantine-like protection. But these cultural practices were unsystematic and often undermined by other factors. The same religions that emphasized purity also required large gatherings for festivals and rituals. The same cultures that had taboos around disease also practiced behaviors that spread infection. Without understanding transmission mechanisms, ancient societies couldn't develop comprehensive, effective public health strategies. Trade routes were highways for disease, connecting previously isolated populations and exposing them to new pathogens. The Silk Road connected East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Merchants traveled these routes carrying silk, spices, precious metals, and ideas. They also carried diseases. An outbreak in China could reach the Mediterranean within months, spread by merchants, soldiers, and travelers who had no idea they were disease carriers. The route wasn't a single road, but a network of paths through deserts, mountains, and steppes. Caravanserais, fortified rest stops, provided shelter and supplies for travelers, but they also acted as disease mixing points. Merchants from different regions, carrying different local diseases, congregated in these enclosed spaces, sharing meals, sleeping in communal areas, trading goods that might be contaminated. A sick merchant arriving at a caravanserai could infect dozens of others who then carried diseases in all directions. The Mongol Empire's expansion in the 13th and 14th centuries created unprecedented connectivity across Eurasia. The Mongols established safe trade routes, standardized currencies, and postal systems that facilitated commerce and communication across vast distances. But they also created conditions for disease spread on a scale never seen before. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the 14th century, probably originated in Central Asia and spread along Mongol trade routes. Sea routes similarly spread disease. Ships were floating incubators, crews and passengers packed into tight spaces, sharing contaminated water and food, breathing each other's air. The bilge water in ship holds became stagnant, breeding mosquitoes and harboring bacteria. Rats thrived on ships, living on stored grain and multiplying in the dark recesses of cargo holds, carrying fleas infected with plague. Voyages often took weeks or months, during which disease could spread through the entire crew and passenger manifest. A sailor infected at the port of departure might not develop symptoms until the ship was halfway to its destination. By then, he'd infected multiple shipmates who would carry the disease to the next port. Ships arriving in port brought not just cargo, but whatever diseases they'd picked up at previous stops or developed during the voyage. Port cities, the nodes in global trade networks, experienced disease outbreaks more frequently than inland settlements. Alexandria, Constantinople, Venice, Genoa, Canton. These great trading hubs saw regular epidemics brought by ships from across the known world. But trade was too valuable to stop, and no one understood the mechanisms anyway. Merchants and city officials grumbled about disease, but accepted it as the price of commerce. The Columbian Exchange, the biological exchange between the Americas and Afro-Eurasia following Columbus's voyages, created one of history's greatest epidemiological catastrophes. Europeans brought smallpox, measles, typhus, and other diseases to the Americas. Native American populations with no prior exposure and no immunity died in staggering numbers. Some estimates suggest 90% or more of the indigenous population died within a century of contact. The devastation went beyond mortality statistics. Entire civilizations collapsed as disease killed their populations faster than societies could adapt. The Inca Empire fell partly because smallpox killed the emperor and much of the elite, creating succession crises and civil war that the Spanish exploited. The Aztec Empire similarly collapsed as disease devastated the population. Countless smaller societies simply disappeared, their populations reduced below viable levels, their knowledge and cultures lost forever. Europeans didn't understand what they were doing. They saw native peoples dying from diseases Europeans considered relatively mild childhood illnesses. They interpreted this as divine providence, proof that God favored European colonization. Some deliberately spread disease through contaminated blankets and other items, primitive biological warfare. But most of the devastation was unintentional, the consequence of contact between populations with vastly different disease exposure histories. The Americas sent syphilis to Europe, a disease previously unknown in Afro-Eurasia. The evidence suggests that syphilis existed in the Americas before European contact and spread to Europe with returning sailors and colonists. The disease, a sexually transmitted bacterial infection, caused horrific symptoms in its untreated form. Initial infection caused genital sores. Secondary stage brought rashes, fever, and swollen lymph nodes. Tertiary stage, which could occur years or decades after initial infection, caused neurological damage, cardiovascular problems, and ultimately death. Syphilis spread rapidly through Europe after the late 15th century, carried by soldiers, sailors, and prostitutes. It became known by various names, usually blaming foreigners. The French called it the Italian disease. Italians called it the French disease. Everyone called it the disease of the other, refusing to take responsibility. The social impacts were enormous. Syphilis carried stigma because of its sexual transmission. Victims were blamed for their own illness, seen as morally corrupt. But the disease didn't discriminate, infecting the virtuous and the promiscuous, the wealthy and the poor, the powerful and the powerless. Kings, popes, artists, merchants, soldiers, peasants, all fell victim to a disease no one understood and no one could cure. Armies were perhaps the most efficient disease spreaders in the ancient world. Military campaigns moved thousands of men across vast distances. These men came from different regions, bringing different diseases. They lived in crowded, unsanitary military camps where disease spread rapidly. They besieged cities, sometimes for months, creating conditions perfect for epidemic disease in both besieging and besieged populations. Military camps were disease disasters waiting to happen. Thousands of soldiers crowded into temporary settlements with inadequate sanitation. Latrines dug too close to water sources contaminated drinking water. Food supplies, often inadequate or spoiled, failed to provide proper nutrition. Soldiers slept in tents packed with comrades, sharing lice, fleas, and respiratory infections. Wounded soldiers developed infections from battlefield injuries treated with unsterilized instruments and dirty bandages. Camp diseases, dysentery, typhus, typhoid, killed thousands of soldiers who never saw battle. Army surgeons did what they could, but ancient military medicine was even less effective than civilian medicine. Surgeons operated in filthy conditions, reusing instruments without sterilization, spreading infections from patient to patient. Amputation, often necessary for severely injured limbs, was performed without anesthesia or antibiotics, resulting in survival rates of maybe 50%. Typhus, spread by lice, thrived in military camps where soldiers rarely bathed or changed clothes. The disease caused high fever, severe headache, and a distinctive rash. It killed perhaps a quarter or more of those infected. Soldiers living in close quarters, sharing bedding and clothing, passed lice from person to person, spreading typhus throughout entire armies. Napoleon's Grand Army, retreating from Russia in 1812, was devastated by typhus. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died, more from disease than from Russian attacks or the brutal winter. The army left a trail of diseased corpses across Eastern Europe, spreading typhus to civilian populations. The retreat became a mobile plague outbreak that killed indiscriminately. Military sieges created unique disease conditions. Besieging armies camped outside city walls for months, their camps becoming cesspools of disease. Besieged cities overcrowded with civilians and soldiers. Insufficient food and water, ran out of supplies, and watched disease spread through their trapped populations. Often sieges ended not because walls were breached, but because disease killed defenders until resistance collapsed. The siege of Jerusalem by Romans in 70 CE saw both sides suffering from disease. The defenders, crowded into the city with limited water and food, experienced outbreaks of various diseases. The besiegers, camped outside for months, dealt with their own disease problems. The combination of starvation and disease killed tens of thousands before the Romans finally breached the walls. Rape and pillage, standard practices in ancient warfare, spread sexually transmitted diseases. Soldiers sexually assaulted civilian populations in conquered cities, spreading syphilis, gonorrhea, and other STDs. These diseases then infected the soldiers, who carried them to new locations. The 30 Years' War in Europe spread syphilis across the continent, as armies of various nations moved through territories, assaulting populations and spreading disease. Military historians often note that more soldiers died from disease than combat throughout most of history. This wasn't an accident or bad luck, it was inevitable given the conditions armies operated in. Crowding, poor nutrition, inadequate sanitation, exposure to new diseases in foreign lands, contact with populations carrying different pathogens, all created perfect conditions for epidemic disease. Some military leaders learned through bitter experience to pay attention to sanitation and soldier health. Roman legions maintained disciplined camp procedures, dig latrines in specific locations, organized waste disposal, and enforced some hygienic practices. These measures probably reduced disease rates compared to less disciplined armies, though Romans didn't understand why their practices worked. But even the best military hygiene of the ancient world was inadequate against epidemic disease. When plague struck an army, whether camped or marching, it spread through the ranks regardless of discipline or hygiene. Commanders watched helplessly as their forces melted away from disease, campaigns abandoned, conquests reversed, all because invisible pathogens killed faster than enemy armies. Pilgrimage routes also spread disease across vast distances. Millions of people traveled to religious sites, to Mecca, to Jerusalem, to Rome, to sacred rivers in India, to temples and shrines across the ancient world. These pilgrims came from diverse backgrounds and regions, congregated in crowded conditions at holy sites, shared food and water, participated in rituals involving physical contact, and then dispersed back to their home communities, potentially carrying new diseases. The Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, brought hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from across the Islamic world to a small area in Western Arabia. Pilgrims walked, rode camels, or sailed to Mecca, a journey that could take months. During the pilgrimage itself, they crowded into Mecca and surrounding holy sites, performing rituals that involved close physical proximity. They drank from the Zamzam well, a shared water source. They slept in temporary camps with minimal sanitation. Disease outbreaks during the Hajj were common and devastating. Cholera epidemics killed thousands of pilgrims in the 19th century, though similar outbreaks probably occurred earlier but weren't recorded. Respiratory diseases spread rapidly in crowded conditions. Dysentery killed pilgrims, weakened by long journeys and inadequate nutrition. Pilgrims who survived and returned home sometimes brought diseases to previously unaffected regions, sparking local epidemics. Christian pilgrimage to Jerusalem and other Holy Land sites similarly spread disease. The Crusades, while military campaigns, also included thousands of religious pilgrims traveling to reclaim Christian holy sites. These pilgrims mixed with local populations, with crusader armies, and with pilgrims from across Europe. They returned carrying diseases endemic to the Middle East that weren't common in Europe. Hindu pilgrimage to sacred rivers, particularly the Ganges, brought millions of worshippers to bathe in holy waters. The Ganges, while religiously significant, was also contaminated with human waste, agricultural runoff, and decomposing corpses, making it a perfect vector for waterborne diseases. Pilgrims bathed in the river, drank the water, and considered it purifying. They then returned home, potentially carrying cholera, dysentery, or other waterborne infections. Kumbh Mela, the massive Hindu pilgrimage festival that occurs every 12 years, gathered millions of pilgrims in temporary cities erected along riverbanks. The crowding, inadequate sanitation, and shared water sources created conditions for disease outbreaks that killed thousands. But the religious significance of the pilgrimage meant people came despite the risks, accepting potential death as part of their spiritual journey. Religious authorities sometimes recognized disease risks and implemented health measures during pilgrimages. Requirements for cleanliness before participating in rituals, restrictions on contact during known epidemics, isolation of sick pilgrims from healthy ones. But these measures were framed religiously as ritual purity requirements, not public health interventions. The effect was sometimes the same, reduced disease transmission, but the understanding was absent. The compulsion to complete pilgrimage regardless of health status spread disease even more effectively. Pilgrims who fell ill during their journey often continued, believing that reaching the holy site would cure them, or that dying during pilgrimage ensured salvation. These sick pilgrims infected everyone they encountered, spreading disease along entire pilgrimage routes. Climate played a significant but poorly understood role in disease patterns. Certain diseases thrived in specific climate conditions. Malaria in warm, wet regions where mosquitoes bred prolifically. Respiratory infections in cold seasons when people crowded indoors and air circulation decreased. Waterborne diseases during rainy seasons when flooding contaminated water sources. Ancient observers noticed these seasonal patterns, but explained them through miasma theory or astrological influences, not through understanding how temperature and moisture affected pathogen survival and vector behavior. The plague seemed to follow seasonal patterns, appearing in spring and summer, declining in winter. This probably reflected the behavior of rat populations and flea activity, which increased during warmer months. But ancient people didn't make this connection. They observed that plague struck during certain seasons and attributed it to cosmic or divine factors associated with those times of year. Malaria's seasonal pattern was obvious to ancient populations. The disease appeared during and after wet seasons when mosquito populations exploded. It diminished during dry seasons when mosquito breeding sites dried up. People noticed the correlation with marshes and wet conditions, but attributed causation to miasma, the bad air from swamps, rather than mosquitoes bred in swampy water. Some ancient societies developed practices that accidentally protected against seasonal disease risks without understanding the actual mechanisms, avoiding travel during malaria season, staying indoors during cold, wet weather when respiratory disease risk peaked. These practices were maintained through tradition and superstition rather than medical understanding. Climate events like droughts, floods, and unusually harsh winters created conditions for epidemic disease. Drought reduced water availability, forcing people to use contaminated sources they'd normally avoid. It killed crops, causing famine that weakened immune systems. Floods contaminated wells and water supplies, spreading waterborne diseases. They displaced populations, creating refugee camps with crowded, unsanitary conditions, perfect for disease transmission. Harsh winters killed the weak and vulnerable, but they also drove people indoors, into crowded, poorly ventilated spaces where respiratory diseases spread easily. The pattern was consistent across climates and cultures. Climate stress, whether drought, flood, or extreme temperature, created conditions that facilitated disease outbreaks. Volcanic eruptions could affect climate on regional or global scales, leading to crop failures, famine, and subsequent disease. The eruption of Tambora in 1815 caused the year without a summer in 1816, leading to widespread crop failures, famine, and disease outbreaks across the northern hemisphere. Similar eruptions probably occurred in the ancient world with similar consequences, though the historical record is sparse. Famine created conditions for epidemic disease through multiple mechanisms. Malnourished populations had weakened immune systems, making them more susceptible to infection and less able to fight disease once infected. Desperate people ate contaminated food or drank contaminated water they'd normally avoid, increasing exposure to foodborne and waterborne diseases. Famine drove migration as people sought food elsewhere, spreading diseases to new areas and creating refugee populations living in crowded, unsanitary conditions. The combination of famine and epidemic disease was devastating beyond either alone. The famine weakened everyone, the disease killed them. Those who survived the famine often died in the subsequent epidemic. The compounding catastrophes could reduce populations by enormous percentages, with recovery taking generations, if it happened at all. Ancient writers described famines followed by plagues with depressing regularity. Crops failed due to drought, flood, locust infestation, or warfare destroying agricultural infrastructure. People starved, their bodies weakened, disease struck. Those who survived the famine often died in the subsequent epidemic. The double catastrophe devastated entire regions. The four horsemen of the apocalypse, described in the biblical book of Revelation, captured this ancient understanding of how disasters compounded. Conquest, war, famine, and pestilence weren't separate catastrophes, but linked events that fed each other. War brought famine as armies destroyed crops and disrupted agriculture. Famine brought disease as weakened populations succumbed to infection, and the cycle continued, each disaster creating conditions for the next. War created similar conditions to famine, often causing famine as a secondary effect. Armies destroyed crops and food stores, either deliberately as a military tactic or incidentally during campaigns. Displaced populations fled conflict, crowding into cities or becoming refugees. Normal sanitation systems broke down as governments collapsed or diverted resources to warfare. Food became scarce as trade routes disrupted and agriculture abandoned. Malnutrition weakened everyone, soldiers and civilians alike. Disease arrived, exploiting weakened immune systems, spreading through crowded refugee camps and besieged cities, killing soldiers and civilians with equal efficiency. The 30 Years' War in 17th century Europe killed more people through disease and famine than battlefield casualties. The pattern repeated throughout history. War disrupted society. Disruption created conditions for famine and disease. Disease finished what war started. Entire regions could be depopulated by this combination. Contemporary accounts from areas affected by prolonged warfare describe landscapes emptied of people, villages abandoned, fields overgrown with only occasional survivors emerging from hiding. The economic recovery from such devastation took decades or centuries, if it occurred at all. The psychological and social impacts of plague were as devastating as the mortality. Communities that lost a third or half their population in a matter of months suffered trauma that lasted generations. Survivors had watched their families die, often in horrible ways, unable to help or even comfort them for fear of infection. They'd seen social order collapse as normal rules, and behaviors disappeared under pressure of catastrophe. People abandoning dying relatives violated fundamental social norms. What happened with disturbing frequency during severe plagues? The sick were left alone to die because helping meant almost certain death for caregivers. Parents abandoned children. Children fled dying parents. Spouses deserted each other. These behaviors created deep guilt and shame in survivors who knew they'd violated basic human decency but felt they had no choice. Corpses left unburied violated religious and cultural norms in almost every ancient society. Proper burial was considered essential for the deceased's journey to the afterlife and for maintaining social order. But during severe plagues, the sheer number of dead overwhelmed burial capacity. Bodies piled in streets, decomposing in homes thrown into rivers, or mass graves without ceremony or identification. Violence and looting during plagues shattered assumptions about social cohesion. Looters ransacked homes of the dead and dying, stealing anything valuable. Riots erupted as crowds demanded food, medicine, or scapegoats to blame. Armed gangs took advantage of collapsed authority to rob and murder. The thin veneer of civilization disappeared quickly when death surrounded everyone and law enforcement either died or fled. The breakdown of law and social cohesion during plagues revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature and social order. Civilization depended on shared norms, mutual trust, and functioning institutions. When plague killed large percentages of the population, when authorities fled or died, when normal rules obviously no longer applied, some people became predatory, taking advantage of chaos. This taught survivors that order was fragile, that the social contract could dissolve rapidly under sufficient stress. Religious responses to plague ranged from penitential to violent. Flagellant movements emerged during the Black Death in medieval Europe, groups of people who whipped themselves bloody in public, believing their suffering would appease God and end the plague. They marched from town to town, their processions becoming mobile super-spreader events that probably accelerated plague transmission even as participants believed they were stopping it. The flagellants believed that the Black Death was divine punishment for human sin. By punishing themselves, by suffering voluntarily, they hoped to satisfy God's demand for penance and end the plague. Their processions grew to thousands of participants in some regions. They whipped themselves with leather scourges embedded with metal pieces, drawing blood and creating horrific wounds. They fasted and prayed. They denounced the clergy as corrupt. The movement became problematic for religious authorities. The flagellants operated outside church control, claimed direct access to God and sometimes challenged church doctrine. They stirred up anti-clerical sentiment by claiming priests were useless against the plague, and they became violent, attacking Jews and other minorities they blamed for the plague. Eventually, the Pope condemned the movement and secular authorities suppressed it, but not before it had spread across Europe and contributed to plague transmission. Religious minorities, especially Jews, were scapegoated and massacred during plague outbreaks, accused of poisoning wells or practicing witchcraft to spread disease. The accusations were absurd. Jews died from plague at the same rates as Christians. Some Jewish communities actually had lower mortality, probably because Jewish religious law required hand washing before meals and after handling corpses, reducing disease transmission. But this lower mortality was used as evidence of guilt. If Jews weren't dying, it must be because they caused the plague and knew how to protect themselves. Pogroms against Jewish communities occurred throughout Europe during the Black Death. Entire communities were massacred, burned alive in their synagogues or driven out of cities. Thousands died in violence that had nothing to do with disease and everything to do with scapegoating the vulnerable. The trauma of these massacres affected Jewish communities for centuries. Other minorities and marginal groups were also targeted. Lepers, beggars, foreigners, anyone who seemed different or suspicious became potential scapegoats. Terrified populations needed someone to blame, and vulnerable minorities were convenient targets. The social violence during plagues often killed as many or more people as the diseases themselves. Economic impacts of plagues were profound and long-lasting. Plagues killed workers, craftsmen, farmers, merchants. The loss of skilled labor disrupted economies for decades. Fields went untilled for lack of farmers, sometimes permanently reverting to forest or wasteland. Workshops closed for lack of artisans, entire crafts disappearing when knowledge holders died without training apprentices. Trade routes collapsed for lack of merchants willing to risk travel through plague regions. The economic contractions following major plagues could last generations as societies struggled to rebuild populations and productive capacity. Tax revenues collapsed as the tax base shrank. Governments became insolvent, unable to pay soldiers, maintain infrastructure, or provide basic services. Economic depression followed plague as reliably as disease followed famine. But there were occasional silver linings for survivors, though calling them silver linings feels grotesque given the suffering required to produce them. In societies where labor was abundant and land scarce, plagues that killed large percentages of the population paradoxically improved conditions for survivors. With fewer workers, labor became more valuable. Peasants could demand better wages and working conditions. Land became available for those who previously had none. The Black Death in medieval Europe led to the breakdown of feudalism, partly because the labor shortage empowered peasants to demand freedom and better treatment. Landlords who previously could rely on abundant servile labor suddenly faced shortages. Peasants demanded wages or simply left to find better situations elsewhere. Attempts to reimpose feudal controls through laws fixing wages and restricting movement largely failed because labor scarcity gave workers leverage they'd never had before. Real wages increased dramatically in the century. Following the Black Death, as workers captured economic value their labor created, living standards improved for survivors, more protein in diets, better housing, more consumer goods. The redistribution of wealth from a decimated population created a more prosperous middle class. This improved living standard probably made populations healthier and more resistant to future disease outbreaks. But the price was horrific. Tens of millions dead, societies traumatized, families destroyed. The economic benefits for survivors couldn't compensate for the human cost, and the economic improvements were accidental, byproducts of catastrophe, not intentional policy or progress. Knowledge about disease spread through texts, oral traditions, and bitter experience. Ancient medical texts compiled observations about diseases, their symptoms, their patterns, their supposed causes and cures. These texts were copied, translated, transmitted across cultures. Galen's works influenced Islamic medicine, which preserved and expanded them during Europe's Dark Ages. Islamic physicians' works later influenced medieval European medicine when translated into Latin. Chinese medical texts circulated throughout East Asia, spreading Chinese medical theories. But the fundamental theories remained wrong, and so the treatments remained ineffective. No amount of careful observation could overcome wrong theoretical frameworks. Ancient physicians observed accurately that certain diseases appeared in certain seasons, that they spread from person to person, that some people seemed resistant while others succumbed quickly. But without understanding microbiology, without microscopes to see pathogens, without statistical methods to identify patterns reliably, they couldn't develop accurate theories of disease causation. Every plague was an experiment, whether ancient people recognized it or not. Physicians tried different treatments. Communities tried different interventions. Some approaches worked better than others. But without understanding why, without controlled experiments and statistical analysis, distinguishing effective measures from random chance was nearly impossible. If a physician tried a new herbal remedy and the patient recovered, was it the remedy or the patient's own immune system or pure luck? Ancient physicians couldn't answer these questions rigorously. Folk remedies proliferated in every culture. Every society developed treatments for common diseases based on local plants, minerals, and practices. Some of these remedies had genuine medicinal value. Quinine from cinchona bark treated malaria effectively long before anyone understood why. Foxglove provided digitalis for heart conditions. Opium provided pain relief. But many folk remedies were useless or harmful. Without systematic testing, distinguishing effective treatments from placebos or dangerous interventions was nearly impossible. The placebo effect complicated matters further. Patients who believed strongly in a treatment sometimes improved, even if the treatment had no actual pharmacological effect. This made it seem like useless remedies worked, reinforcing their use. And nocebo effects, where negative expectations caused harm, meant that patients who believed they were doomed sometimes died even from treatable conditions. The gradual accumulation of medical knowledge did lead to some improvements over centuries and millennia. Physicians learned which herbs helped with which symptoms through trial and error. They developed better surgical techniques, though surgery remained dangerous until the development of anesthesia and antisepsis in the 19th century. They improved childbirth practices, though maternal and infant mortality remained high. Progress happened, but excruciatingly slowly, and repeatedly set back by war, social collapse, and the loss of accumulated knowledge when libraries burned or societies fell. The Library of Alexandria's destruction, whether through fire, neglect, or religious fanaticism, probably set medical knowledge back centuries. The library housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls containing accumulated knowledge from across the ancient Mediterranean world. Medical texts, botanical descriptions, anatomical studies all burned or were lost. Some knowledge survived in copies held elsewhere, but much was lost forever. Similarly, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire led to the loss of medical knowledge in Europe. The infrastructure for training physicians disappeared. Medical texts were no longer copied or studied. Folk remedies and religious healing replaced rational medicine in many regions. It wasn't until Arabic translations of Greek medical texts returned to Europe in the medieval period that medical knowledge began to recover. The greatest barrier to understanding disease wasn't lack of intelligence or observation. Ancient physicians were keen observers who documented symptoms meticulously. They performed autopsies, studied anatomy, experimented with treatments, and developed sophisticated theories. The barrier was conceptual and technological. They couldn't see microorganisms. They had no microscopes, no microbiology, no germ theory. They were trying to understand invisible phenomena with no tools to make those phenomena visible. It was like trying to understand astronomy without telescopes or particle physics without accelerators. The scale of what they needed to observe was beyond their technological capabilities. They could see the effects of disease, but not the causes. They could observe patterns, but not mechanisms. They were working blind, trying to construct accurate theories from incomplete evidence. Some ancient thinkers came tantalizingly close to correct theories. Marcus Terentius Varro, a Roman scholar writing in the 1st century BCE, suggested that tiny creatures too small to see might cause disease. He wrote about swamps breeding certain minute creatures that cannot be seen by the eyes, which float in the air and enter the body through the mouth and nose and cause serious diseases. He was right, but without any way to test his hypothesis, without microscopes to see the creatures he postulated, the idea remained speculation. Varro's insight was ignored by most physicians who preferred the established humoral theory supported by Hippocrates and Galen's authority. A speculative idea from a non-physician couldn't compete with theories backed by centuries of medical tradition and the prestige of famous physicians. The idea that tiny invisible creatures cause disease seemed no more plausible than demonic possession or divine punishment. The concept appeared occasionally in other ancient texts. Lucretius, in his philosophical poem De Rerum Natura, suggested that diseases might be caused by seeds too small to see that floated in the air. Again, the insight was correct but untestable, and therefore remained speculative rather than becoming accepted medical theory. The cumulative effect of thousands of years of epidemic disease on human history is almost impossible to overstate. Plagues shaped which civilizations survived and which collapsed. They influenced migration patterns as people fled disease-ridden areas or moved into depopulated regions. They affected warfare outcomes, with disease killing armies more effectively than enemy soldiers. They drove cultural practices around death, burial, hygiene, and social interaction. Religious beliefs were shaped by plague experience. The idea of divine punishment for sin made sense in a world where invisible forces killed indiscriminately and horribly. The emphasis on afterlife in many religions provided comfort to people living in constant fear of sudden death. Rituals around death and mourning helped societies process incomprehensible loss. Faith provided psychological resources for enduring epidemics that had no cure. Plague influenced art and literature throughout ancient and medieval periods. The dance of death, memento mori imagery, apocalyptic themes in literature and art all reflected societies traumatized by epidemic disease. The idea that death could come at any moment, that social status and wealth provided no protection, that everyone would eventually face judgment. These themes resonated with people who'd watched plagues kill rich and poor, powerful and powerless, pious and sinful, without distinction. The mortality toll across thousands of years of human history is almost incomprehensible. The Antonine Plague killed an estimated 5 to 10 million people in the Roman Empire alone. The Plague of Cyprian killed millions more. The Justinianic Plague killed perhaps 25 to 50 million across the Mediterranean and Middle East over 2 centuries of recurring outbreaks. These numbers are rough estimates based on limited evidence, but even conservative figures suggest that epidemic disease was one of the greatest killers in human history. And between the major named plagues, the ones that made it into historical records because they killed hundreds of thousands or millions, countless smaller outbreaks killed thousands or tens of thousands without being remembered. A village decimated by cholera, a town destroyed by typhus, a city's children killed by measles. These local catastrophes didn't make it into the histories written by elite urban chroniclers, but they were devastating to the people who experienced them. The cumulative death toll across all of human history from epidemic disease probably exceeds deaths from warfare, famine, and natural disasters combined. Disease was humanity's greatest killer, and it remained so until the development of modern medicine in the late 19th and 20th centuries finally gave humanity effective weapons against the microbial world. The ancient world's inability to control epidemic disease fundamentally shaped societies in ways we still see today. High childhood mortality meant large families were necessary to ensure some children survived to adulthood. Life expectancy was low, not because people who survived childhood didn't live long, many did, but because so many died young from disease. Social institutions developed around the assumption that disease was inevitable, uncontrollable, and often fatal. Marriage and family structures reflected disease realities. Women married young and had many children because infant and child mortality was so high. Extended families living together provided care networks when parents died. Inheritance laws assumed that many potential heirs wouldn't survive to inherit. Societies developed practices for managing orphans, widows, and families disrupted by disease deaths. Economic institutions adapted to disease realities. Guilds and professional organizations developed systems for training new members to replace those lost to disease. Apprenticeship systems ensured knowledge transfer before death claimed masters. Property laws facilitated rapid transfer of assets from deceased to survivors. Insurance concepts, though not formalized until later, existed in informal mutual aid societies that helped families cope with death's economic impacts. Religious and philosophical systems grappled with the apparent randomness and injustice of disease. Why did the young die while the old survived? Why did the pious suffer while the wicked prospered? Why did God or the gods allow innocent children to die horribly? These questions produced various theological responses, from concepts of original sin to ideas about testing faith to beliefs in karmic justice across lifetimes. The acceptance of death as ever-present shaped ancient worldviews in profound ways. Modern people, especially in wealthy countries with low mortality rates, can go years without personally experiencing the death of someone close to them. Ancient people grew up surrounded by death. They watched siblings die in childhood. They watched mothers die in childbirth. They watched friends and neighbors die from disease. Death wasn't an abstract future event. It was a constant companion. This familiarity with death created different attitudes than modern societies have. Death wasn't hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes. It happened at home in full view of family. Children saw death regularly and learned to accept it as part of life. Funeral and mourning practices were more public and elaborate, helping communities process collective loss. The idea of a good death, dying at home surrounded by family, properly prepared spiritually, became important across many cultures. But familiarity didn't mean acceptance without grief or trauma. Ancient people mourned their dead as deeply as modern people do. They grieved lost children, lost spouses, lost parents. They suffered psychological trauma from watching loved ones die horrible deaths. They experienced survivor guilt when they lived while others died. The emotional toll was enormous, even if expressed differently than in modern grief. Religion offered comfort and explanation when medicine offered neither. If physicians couldn't cure disease, perhaps priests could intercede with gods. If disease seemed random and cruel, perhaps it was divine punishment for sin, which at least gave it meaning and suggested potential remedies through repentance and ritual. Faith provided psychological resources for enduring epidemics that had no cure. Whether religious beliefs were objectively true didn't matter for their psychological function. They helped people maintain hope and meaning in the face of catastrophic loss. They provided frameworks for understanding suffering. They offered rituals and practices that gave people something to do when they felt helpless. They created community bonds that supported people through grief and trauma. These functions were valuable regardless of theological truth. The transition from ancient medicine to something resembling modern understanding took over 1,000 years and required multiple conceptual and technological revolutions. The development of microscopy in the 17th century allowed scientists to see microorganisms for the first time. Antony van Leeuwenhoek observed bacteria and protozoa, calling them animalcules, demonstrating that invisible living creatures existed. But even this didn't immediately lead to germ theory. Most scientists thought these creatures were spontaneously generated from decaying matter, not causes of disease. The germ theory of disease developed gradually in the 19th century by scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, finally explained how infection actually worked. Specific microorganisms caused specific diseases. These organisms could be identified, studied, and potentially controlled. The theory revolutionized medicine by providing an accurate framework for understanding disease causation. Antibiotics and vaccines, mostly 20th century developments, finally gave humanity effective weapons against bacterial and viral diseases. Penicillin, discovered accidentally by Alexander Fleming in 1928, proved that bacterial infections could be cured chemically. Vaccines developed from Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine in 1796 through modern vaccines for dozens of diseases proved that immunity could be artificially induced without enduring the disease itself. Public health measures based on understanding disease transmission finally allowed societies to control epidemic disease. Clean water systems, modern sewage treatment, food safety regulations, mandatory vaccination programs, disease surveillance and response systems all depended on accurate understanding of how diseases spread. These measures, more than medical treatment, drove the dramatic decline in mortality from infectious disease in the 20th century. But in the ancient world, before any of these developments, Humans faced disease essentially defenseless. They tried everything: herbs, prayers, sacrifices, bloodletting, purging, quarantine, amulets, magic spells. They tried with desperate sincerity to find something, anything, that would stop the dying. Most of it didn't work. Some of it made things worse, and the plagues kept coming, generation after generation, killing millions, destroying cities, reshaping civilizations, and finally disappearing as mysteriously as they'd arrived, leaving behind mass graves, traumatized survivors, and no understanding of what had just happened or how to prevent it from happening again. This was humanity's experience of epidemic disease for thousands of years, not the dramatic, heroic struggle we might imagine, but confusion, helplessness, suffering, and death on a scale that defies comprehension. The ancient plagues spread through mechanisms invisible to their victims. They killed without mercy or meaning, and humanity endured them not through understanding or effective response, but through sheer stubborn survival. The lucky survived. Those with genetic resistance to specific diseases, those geographically isolated from major trade routes, those randomly spared by chance, they lived. Everyone else died, and the cycle repeated, plague after plague, year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, until finally, far too late for the billions who had already died, humanity began to understand what had been killing them all along. And even then, even with modern medicine, the struggle continues. New diseases emerge, old diseases adapt and return. The microbial world evolves faster than human medicine can respond, but at least now we understand. We can see the enemy. We can develop treatments and preventions based on actual knowledge rather than wrong theories. We've won battles, even eradicated some diseases entirely, though the war continues and probably always will. The story of ancient plagues is ultimately a story about the limits of knowledge and the cost of ignorance. Ancient people weren't stupid or lazy. They observed carefully, thought deeply, tried desperately to understand and control the diseases that killed them. But they lacked the conceptual frameworks and technological tools needed to see what was actually happening. They were fighting blind, and they paid for that blindness with millions upon millions of lives across thousands of years of human history. We live in a world transformed by the knowledge they lacked, a world where epidemic disease, while still dangerous, is manageable rather than apocalyptic, where most children survive to adulthood, where death from infection is the exception rather than the rule. We owe that transformation to the scientists, physicians, and public health workers who finally cracked the code, who finally understood what ancient people could only observe and fear. But we shouldn't forget what came before, the thousands of years when disease ruled unchallenged, when plagues spread invisibly, killed indiscriminately, and left humanity helpless in the face of death. That was the ancient world. That was how plagues spread before modern medicine. And understanding that history, understanding how vulnerable humans were for so long, might help us appreciate what we have and motivate us to preserve it, because the microbial world hasn't changed. Only our understanding has. And if we lose that understanding, if we forget or reject the knowledge that protects us, we could find ourselves back where our ancestors were, fighting invisible enemies we don't understand, watching people die for reasons we can't explain, helpless against forces we can't control. That's the real lesson of ancient plagues. Knowledge matters, science matters. Understanding reality accurately matters more than comforting myths. Because when disease comes, and it always comes eventually, only knowledge can save us. Everything else is just hoping the invisible killers pass us by.